Hi, my name is Madeline Burkhart, and I'm one of the facilitators of the Listen to My Story project, which is part of the larger Investing in Justice projects. And I'm really happy to introduce Carmen Shields. Carmen is the sister of Dorianne, and Dorianne is a woman who lived at the Huronia Regional Centre for over 35 years. And Carmen is here today to share with us her stories of growing up with Dorianne, what it was like to be a sister of Dorianne, and Carmen's encounters with Dorianne through the institution. So thank you, Carmen, for coming. We're looking forward to it.
I thought I would take you way back in time to when Dorianne was born. As you know, she's 60 or 61, so that's not yesterday. Dorianne is 10 years younger than me. I'm the oldest sibling, and we have a brother in the middle who's 5 years on either side. When Dorianne was born, our mother was 40. In those days, especially, I guess, an age of potential complications that nobody expected because there were two children already. And at first, Dorianne seemed to be okay. She had one wandering eye that was fixed when she was, whatever the ripe age was, I think it was 16 months. And all the milestones were missing. Slow to do everything, or things weren't happening. And when she was 2, I'm sure my parents must have been worried without consulting a 10-year-old. And finally, the doctor gave the magic words of the day: your daughter is mentally retarded. And she, finally by 3, she did walk with the help of a hand on each side. But she was very, very autistic. Her behavior was very, very poor and rough as she aged. And my mom was a small person, not nearly as tall or as broad as me. And she stayed at home till she was around the age of 7. People started, especially the doctor, the hero, my mother's hero, saying it was time for her to leave home because it was damaging the other 2 children, and on it went. So she inquired about a private institution, and the doctor said no, because nobody checks on children in those places. So off to Huronia she went, in Aurelia. And I think it was at that time 3 months before you were allowed to have a visit. And then we went, which we religiously did on Sundays until my dad was too old to drive up there anymore. And there she was in a ward, probably at least 40 kids in a ward, and they all had their little cots. That's all they really had. No, you couldn't send clothes for your own child. It was all just randomly in a place, and things got put on in the morning. My mom was so distressed because there was nothing she could offer her that was actually hers. And then gradually over the years, she came out of the ward, which was for the youngest children, and moved from, they called them apartments, which is amazing if you've ever seen the place, but from place to place until her last place, she was with 8 other women. All these years, the list of drugs was extremely beyond my ability to make sense of them. So in her last apartment, everybody was just sitting there. Whether I visited morning, noon, or night didn't matter. They were all just not comatose, but close to comatose, really. No trouble to anybody. So that the behaviors of the past were extinguished by those means. There was a time, so I'll just jump forward for a minute and then I'll go back. And I'd like to read a few little pieces to you from my doctoral thesis. She was in taken to Aurelia, as they were, I guess, 1 or 2 at a time for outings. And Dorianne still loves nothing more than a cookie or a treat, and she always has done. She did then too. And she sat down on the sidewalk and she wouldn't move. And the worker didn't know what to do and got some help and got her back to the institution. And whereupon a whole investigation of her legs went on. So in her files, when I got them to make her case for abuse from Huronia, here were one huge box of all the day files, one huge box from all the doctor files, so I could collate back and forth and see what was going on as I made her case for funds. And the legs seemed to be a big deal. Something must be wrong with her legs. And there were x-rays taken to Barrie to the hospital, on and on and on. But actually, that was my sister's way of avoiding abuse. Avoiding any more sexual abuse was just to simply not move her legs. And from there on, she was in a wheelchair and has remained in a wheelchair. But she did walk when she was a little girl. And then the reports would come of she's got a leg fracture, she's hurt her private area in the gym. So I could see all the letters that were sent home by physicians. To me, it all just completely pointed to abuse until finally one wonderful doctor named it, God bless him, and wrote it down. And she'd actually had an abortion there. So my poor parents, of course, luckily knew nothing of these things, very Victorian people that they were. And they didn't have to see the files. And when that all ended, my partner and I had a bonfire on our property and happily burned it up because it was just too much to have all that awful stuff around in our house. Just contextually, I'm just going to, I won't offer you the references, but I'll just, so this, my doctoral thesis is a long time ago. I wrote it in 1997. My sister's driven me to do a lot of things, and this was one of them. So I've taught many handicapped kids. I've been a resource teacher, a consultant for a province of Nova Scotia, for disabilities, and finally turned myself into a professor. And basically, I think the one thing that I've tried to do when I realized I couldn't fix my sister, although I tried for many years when I was still at home, was help other people as best as I could. So that's kind of, she's the driving force. This is called Behind Objective Description, Special Education and the Reality of Lived Experience. And it's a narrative thesis, so it's storied. So I'll just, this was just the beginning of what I wrote then. This comes from literature. It wasn't until the year my sister was born, 1958, that the Council for Exceptional Children, a powerful education organization in North America, began its first group in Canada. 10 years later, my sister was already living in an institution. I was 12 years old in 1960 when my parents were told that my sister was mentally retarded and an institutional placement would be the best thing for her and for the rest of the family. My mother held out for 5 more years, and my sister remained at home. Until she was 7, she was behaviorally very difficult. My sister didn't walk until she was 3, was not toilet trained, had no language other than mimicking a few words. She had very autistic tendencies that made her unreachable, no eye contact, withdrawn, rocking for hours in her bed alone. As she got a little older, she became destructive, ripping up letters and school papers that I left in the room we shared, breaking things in uncontrollable rages that could never be predicted. My mother barely left the house for those 7 years, and her support came from neighborhood women, female friends from her own school days, and so on, because there were no organizations, there was no playgroup, there was nothing. So it was very, very tough. It was tough when she was at home, and my mother really never, I would say, never really recovered from her being in an institution. So we would go on Sundays, my brother and I in the back seat, and all the way home my mother would cry. And that was from Orillia to Toronto in those days. And that never seemed to change. The building itself, so I eventually moved to Wolfville, Nova Scotia, the home of Acadia University, and went to school. And that's another whole story. But what really struck me is there was as many people in Huronia as there was in the town of Wolfville. 3,600 people lived there, if you can actually call it living. That's where they were housed. I remember how frightening it was for me to be whatever the age I was going in there. It wasn't like there was a nice meeting room to sit and meet your family. It was, she's in the ward. And you'd go into the sea of insane humanity. And it was very rough. The children, you know, obviously fought for their place. I remember she grabbed a cigarette from my mother's purse. I think she was maybe 9 or 10. And they cut all the kids' hair the same, so you really had to look for your family member because they all had the bowl cut. And she was really rough. I can remember how she used to just sort of push and punch, and with no words, that was her way of communicating. So she, I think it was 1 year, it was a Liberal government in Ontario, so I was coming and going from Nova Scotia to Ontario. Somebody visited my mother. Luckily, I was there and said, "We're closing institutions." And my mother was absolutely horrified because she couldn't imagine that my sister could live anywhere in the world. Like, where would she go? She couldn't come home. By then, my mom could barely walk. My dad had passed away. And she was adamant, you know, if there's the last person out of there, I'd like it to be my daughter. I want her to stay there. And what I'd done over the last number of years when Mom wasn't able, I would finish work in Halifax, and I would hop the plane once a month, and I would drive up, take the car, drive to Orillia, make sure everything was okay, drive back, have a couple of nights with my mother, and go back basically to the office, because I didn't live in Halifax anyway. I lived in the Annapolis Valley. But anyway, I was very thin then. I was a very thin person in those days. It never got easier, and it's not easy now for me. So our brother did come to see Dorianne once. He kind of disappeared from the family, and I actually had quite a time getting her out of Orillia because he wouldn't sign the papers. But eventually, it all worked. And it's very typical in a family like mine, I think, that there's fractures, schisms where the other siblings don't. They're happy not to see each other more than to see each other. It was all just too hard and too much. But now he's had several strokes, and he himself lives in an institution in Nova Scotia now, so he luckily got to come that once before he had a stroke that paralyzed his left side. So I could say so it took me until I was 42 doing my doctoral work before I told the story of my sister. And it wasn't, I do write in here, it wasn't that Mom and Dad actively said, don't talk about the fact that your sister's handicapped, but my brother and I both knew that that was just something that we shouldn't do, that would upset them. So we never did. So I was 42 when I told this story to my doctoral cohort, and that was one of the hardest things I think I've ever done. And my brother, I don't know. I don't know if he ever has spoken about that or not. I know he's spoken with it about his own to his own children, his 4 children. So I think really mental health suffered. Not only we always thought it was my mother, but I can certainly say at this point it was myself, it was my brother. The family really took a beating. Of course, my mother had no training in pretty much anything, and she did her best. but she was definitely not equipped for handling a very destructive, very autistic, low-functioning kid. She was the wrong mom to get my sister, really. So, for instance, I've often thought in the house, if my mom had got Janet, life would have been very different, you know? When I was finishing this work, I just did a little story, a little description of still the institution. A few weeks ago, I visited my sister in the institution where she's lived most of her life. She lives in a small apartment on the grounds with 6 other women, and she's lived with them for a number of years now. I arrived at dusk on a late summer evening, having called ahead to staff to say I'd be late. The last of the sun was going down behind the huge pine trees that surrounded the building as I walked up the path to the entrance. I opened the main door, feeling all the emotional ties to the past that I always do. It's as if my mother and father, my brother, and all the turmoil of family visits from years gone by await me in that opening. And I can say, when I come into Gamble House now, that's still the way it is for me. That is not ever going, to go anywhere. I push the door open, and my mother and my father and my brother and all those years are right there with me. And many wonderful people like Jane and Danielle and Cheryl and on have, listened to that and understood it. And I was so happy. I think it was around my sister's birthday. Cheryl said, we can't all love our siblings, but Dorianne does have people that love her now. And I don't think I will ever be that person. I'm very keen that she's well cared for, that she has money in her bank account. I'm very happy to have filled out those ghastly papers to have gotten her some funds for her life there. But I really cannot get past that door with my mother, especially my mother. That's just the way it is. I wanted to read you one more thing that I've written how many stories about my sister's life and my academic life? So many. And they end up in curriculum books. And this is just a story from, this is a 2016 publication. And I called it Challenges to Memory, Reconsidering an Old Story. So as you might imagine, I go back and back and back to this story, and I keep learning. And I keep thinking new thoughts, and I keep pondering what it means to me in my life as I age. This past September, I was interviewed as a participant in a PhD thesis in disability studies. I agreed to be a part of this study because I thought my story could add something to this thesis and perhaps even support others whose lives were lived in a similar fashion to my own. The study focused on the life experience of individuals like myself, whose lives have been lived with a mentally handicapped family member who was institutionalized. My sister, 10 years younger, lived in a public institution for 35 years. For me, the story of the impact of my sister on my life was one I'd written, rewritten, explored, shared as part of my academic work for so many years. So it was with ease that I signed the consent papers for the interview and mentioned to the interviewer, and she wasn't to worry. If I needed support, I'd seek it. And although I didn't expect such an outcome, that was the way it turned out to be. It was the questions back to me from the interviewer that took me to new and troubling places. One question was, so once your sister went to the institution, she never once came home again? The interviewer's voice gave away her incredulity. A follow-up question, what about photos, objects, or other reminders of her life at home? I told her there were none. When my sister was gone, all tangible evidence of her existence in our house was gone too. Following the interview and for many days after, new questions arose, tumbling over each other as I experienced a new sense of dislocation. I was 15 when my sister was institutionalized, yet I found I couldn't remember the day she was driven away or any details about my parents' return home without her. I couldn't remember my sister's clothes in the bedroom closet. And most powerful of all for me was the realization I couldn't remember where my own bed and dresser were in the bedroom that we'd shared. Since that interview day, I found myself traveling back in time to stories I've previously reconstructed about my sister. This road's been a heavily traveled one in the past, and yet I see there is more distance to cover. I've had to pause and rest and rebalance myself as these new and unsettling questions emerge that no one can now answer. My sister cannot speak, and there's no one left to ask. Now, months later, I find myself in the midst of reconsidering the openings created by the interviewer's questions, and for the first time, I've turned my gaze towards our parents, pondering the difficult choices they made in a difficult time that have had lifelong results for me. And once again, pondering the central place of my sister's life and my own existence. And I end just, bringing that to my teaching life. But so that goes, I'll think I've got a handle on this, and oh yes, and then I'll think something like that will happen, and I'm just amazed at all the things that I can't remember. And I was even thinking yesterday, knowing that I was coming down, where was that damn bed? I went to bed every night, can't find it, just can't find it. So it was for me, it's just been, and I'm sure for all the people like me who, of those 3,600 people and those children that were there, and I've certainly met many when Dorianne first moved to Mortimer. I've got his face, but not his name. He's passed away. He had lived there too. Tim. And his family, they had a really rough time. At Christmas, they would come, but you could tell they just couldn't wait to get out of the house, have a quick cup of tea and go. I could tell those siblings were suffering, and I knew that because I was suffering myself. And it's the way life goes for the siblings. And I mean, obviously I'm aging too now, so my parents are long gone. And I'm the one, because my brother posed some difficulties, I got power of attorney so that I wouldn't have any problems taking care of Dorianne. He wanted her moved to Nova Scotia, which was one of the craziest things going because there's no support at all. But I too will pass away. My brother, has to be on a hoist to get in and out of bed now, so he's not exactly going to show up. So one thing I'm so at peace about is with Dorianne's place at L'Arche, I know she's fine. That is something my mother never quite knew. And her last wishes were all, she never said, try to love your sister. She always said, take care of her, make sure she has a good place to be, or food, or enough clothes, or that sort of a thing. So, I look at Dorianne's life, and I don't think she ever really, she got a lot of care at home. She got a lot of abuse in an institution, and her first home was coming to L'Arche. And luckily for me, I could move her to L'Arche in those days. It wasn't, you have to get on a list and you're going to be put somewhere. So I met John Guido many long years ago now, and she was welcomed. And it took her a long time to understand she had a home. She's had a very rocky beginning. Thanks to Jane Powell, she survived. That is, Jane also survived. But I realized my sister, although she does say a few words, but a number of years ago, I think Danielle was the house leader when she phoned on Christmas morning, and Dorianne said to me, "Merry Christmas," in her, whatever voice. It was unbelievable. But I realized going through all those files, she's tried all her life to communicate. And I think it's really important for anybody who works in the disability community, especially on those rough days with people, to think people are they're trying their best to communicate. She sat down on the sidewalk and wouldn't move. Nobody paid attention. She had obviously been sexually abused, and nobody paid any attention. She had broken limbs in Huronia, and nobody paid any attention. And all the while, with her acting out and her, her circle that she had to have to keep herself safe when she first came to L'Arche, and God forbid an assistant should step in that circle and get a good punch, but all those things, she was trying so hard to say something. So, that listening ear has to be developed in such a big way, I think, in the handicapped community, so we can actually understand what people are trying to tell us. So I've been extremely, you can imagine my thrill at Dorianne's life now in L'Arche. A few years ago, she was terribly ill, so ill that I think Kim wasn't sure if she'd make it. And since then, she seems to be, I would say, more settled, happy. I think she knows she has a home. Even, that calmness that I think you might see now is very recent history, and it's wonderful to see. It's like a gift from the gods to see that. So that's really, in a nutshell, I can say I carry my sister wherever I go, and I always will, I know that. And I think it's made me a pretty good professor and teacher in curriculum development, disabilities, and research methods and methodologies, because I learned to really listen and really watch and really pay attention to what people are trying to get across to me and say to me, and thus I'm able to support them in their work. So thank you. That's what I can say about my experience as a sibling of my sister.